If there hadn't been a Thomas Drake, there couldn't have been an Edward Snowden.
Hello everyone, I'm incredibly excited and honored to be speaking with a true American hero, NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake.
Here we had a guy who did absolutely everything right. He placed his faith in the system. He saw, the warrantless wiretapping of hundreds of millions of Americans. He saw corruption. He brought it to the IG. He brought it to the Congress. And rather than protecting him against retaliation, they actively retaliated against him in the most public and aggressive way.
Framed, labeled an enemy of the state, and threatened with life in prison. That's what happened to Tom when he blew the whistle on the fraud, waste, and abuse of the government's illegal warrantless surveillance program. We all know about Edward Snowden, but according to Edward Snowden himself, if there hadn't been a Thomas Drake, there couldn't have been an Edward Snowden. Tom, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Before we get into your nightmarish experience, tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up at the NSA.
Well, that's quite a story in itself. I was in the Air Force during the latter years of the Cold War, flying on RC-135s. I had a short stint at the CIA. I was an intel officer in the Navy down at the Pentagon. My specialty area during those years in the Cold War was actually East Germany. So I got to know East Germany as a surveillance state very, very, very well, listening in on their communications. Never realizing how much that would come back to haunt me later in terms of what happened in the deepest of secrecy after 9/11 inside the United States. Sitting at home in February of 2001, I was a principal in a very small boutique.com, doing very well. But I felt that call to serve my country again, and this is at a very senior level. It turned out the NSA was looking for senior executives from outside NSA, meaning people that had not grown up or been promoted to the senior ranks at NSA. And about a dozen of us were hired under a special outside hiring program. And that's how I ended up at NSA. And my first day on the job was 9/11.
That looks like a second plane.
That just exploded.
And so for me, there's life before 9/11, and then there's life after 9/11. And it's the life after 9/11 that would forever change me. Little did I know, of course, how far the United States government would go to not just take the wheels off the Constitution, which is the rule of law in the US, but we would be in an entirely different vehicle. And it was basically a series of secret decisions and acts and signatures by the president and vice president that created this secret national security regime that no one knew about. So you can imagine, and this is what happened to me, is you start finding out because of where I was and what I did that we were violating the Constitution, and we were looking to Congress to give us all kinds of money. As I recall, 9/11 was a fundamental failure to provide for the common defense. We utterly failed the nation. Almost 3,000 people were murdered that day. We failed to keep people out of harm's way. No. That was not the response of the number 3. Her name's Maureen Baginski. She was a SIGINT director, and she says, no, direct quote, 9/11 is a gift to NSA. We're going to get all the money we want and then some. It was not viewed as a failure. It was viewed as an opportunity. Do not let the crisis go to waste. And so it was already a multi-billion-dollar budget for NSA, quickly doubled over the next 2 to 3 years, and massive amounts of waste. And then there was this other thing. The thing ultimately led to the government coming after me. What they did was take the full power of NSA and say, turn it on the United States. I knew that early on. There was verbal authority that was given. Ultimately, I did not know at the time, although I was aware of meetings taking place downtown. On 4 October, it was official, written presidential finding authorizing what became known, and this is the cover name, Stellar Wind. This is a mass surveillance regime. They quickly grew to include all kinds of surveillance without a warrant, and not just outside the U.S., but fully within the U.S.
The program collected emails, phone conversations, financial transactions, and the web activity of millions of American citizens without a warrant.
And so there you are. What do? We had annual training. You could not spy on an American without a warrant. Could not. There were special provisions, right? But you still had to get a warrant, like an emergency situation where you could temporarily surveil, but you still have to go back for a warrant. There was criminal sanctions, Matt. It was criminal. If you violated the Fourth Amendment, but FISA was Fourth Amendment standard, criminal sanctions. $10,000 fine for each instance, 5 years in prison. No one's ever actually gone to prison or been fined that I am aware of in the entire history of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
It's just mind-blowing that everybody in these intelligence agencies has this training that you're not supposed to be doing this to U.S. persons, but no one speaks out.
As if it didn't matter, right?
Yeah.
See, this is the thing. None of this mattered after 9/11. This is what I keep trying to tell people. Like, well, does it matter? Don't you want to feel protected? I don't care if you're listening into my conversation with my grandma. That's not the point. You're either a nation as a special form of democracy, a republic that honors the rule of law for everybody, or not. And I'm just saying that was abandoned after 9/11. Because now Cheney in particular, and he had tremendous influence over President Bush. And he always said he never minced words about this. It was never hidden. If he ever got into a position of power again, like vice president, because he certainly had designs on. Remember, he at one point was going to run for president. He sort of had an aborted campaign to run for president. He always said he would reestablish the imperial presidency and continue what Nixon had started. So here was his opportunity to unleash the full power of the national security state.
To go to the dark side.
And he said that 5 days after 9/11. We're going to take the gloves off. We're going to go to the dark side. Just trust us.
He actually said that.
What can you do? Now, here I am in a very, very secret agency. I'm sworn. I say sworn. I had to sign non-disclosure agreements, right? We're talking very high level classified, even beyond normal classified. And here we are literally abandoning the Constitution for the sake of national security because we failed to protect the nation and we let almost 3,000 people were murdered that day. That's on us. So now we're just going to use this as an excuse to abandon the very basis of our governance structure, which is the Constitution. So what do? How far are you willing to sacrifice? It was never about me. It was about our rights, which are extraordinarily precious. Remember, we had for all the faults and foibles of the Constitution, and even though landed owners, slave owners, all that mess, right? United States history is, you have to look the gift horse of even U.S. history in the mouth, right? The original sin of slavery, genocide of the indigenous peoples. Let's get real here, right? Most people don't want to get real because they're uncomfortable truths. But leaving that aside, the aspirational side, the focus on rights and freedoms, and what was King George III doing to us, right? Doing to the colonies. Yeah, I get the Declaration of Independence. I get what those inalienable rights are all about. So it's either the ideal means something or it doesn't. Because if you don't have what we know as the Constitution and our precious rights and freedoms, we're not Americans. That does distinguish us.
Yeah, that's one of the main things that distinguished us from the Soviet Union.
Precisely. Otherwise, we're no different. And it becomes what I have called the de-evolution of democracy. Well, that's what happened after 9/11.
So everyone knows the Snowden story. He came out to reveal the surveillance state. Now people still say he should have gone up the chain of command. Now you did that. You showed what happens when that's done. So what did you do and how did you go about it?
Because I wasn't going to violate statute. I wasn't going to violate administrative procedures or policy, nor was I going to willfully violate the law. So there are whistleblower channels. These are disclosure channels. They're supposed to be protected. But given the nature of what I was blowing the whistle on, I mean, any whistle, you don't wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to become a whistleblower. I never saw a whistleblower. The guidance counselor, I don't remember, looking at career choices, I never remember under W seeing whistleblower.
Yeah.
But there I was. And what do you do, right? So, yeah, I started blowing the whistle. I blew the whistle with Maureen Baginski. I ended up going to the Office of General Counsel. I ended up going to the IG's office, Inspector General's office. I ended up going under the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act to the congressional committees, both Senate and House. I had gone through every channel that existed over the course of the 4+ years. So all of those turned out to be exposure channels, and I was severely retaliated against.
Just so we're all clear, everyone says Snowden should have gone through the right channels. You did that.
Yes.
And you're supposed to be protected.
Supposed to be.
But you're not.
But you're not. Look, I can tell you that when I went to Congress, I couldn't prevent myself from being detected. I was pulled aside by Maureen Baginski in February of 2002 after her executive assistant said she needs to speak with you. So out in the hall, she warned me. And this is chilling. I haven't related this in quite a while, but it's just chilling in terms of the context. She says, be careful, Tom. They're looking for leakers. They were not looking for leakers to the press. It was leakers to Congress.
Wow.
They didn't want Congress to know the truth. My final whistleblowing within the system was actually November of 2005 with General Keith Alexander. He was the successor to General Hayden. Hayden ultimately went on to be the head of the CIA.
So you violate the Constitution, you get promoted.
Right. Some.
Yeah. You expose violation of the Constitution and...
Hammered.
Yeah, hammered.
And remember, this is all within the system.
Yeah.
My going to Keith Alexander, the then NSA director, had massive blowback. Massive. They said, we got to get rid of this guy. In 2006, I had no position. I had no people. I had no programs. No one reported to me. I literally was a person of one. That was the internal retaliation.
They put you in the basement like the stapler guy in Office
Pretty much
Space.
did.
Yeah.
That it was, you can think of the stapler. That's right. What a movie. It's one of my all-time favorites. Well, because I used to do a lot of consulting in Silicon Valley and used to consult in nondescript office buildings that looked just like Office Space. But yes, I had my stapler. It wasn't red, but the handwriting was on the wall. The New York Times article, I have to remember, the New York Times article came out. James Risen, Eric Lichtblau, revealing for the first time, which turned out was the tip of the iceberg, the so-called warrantless wiretapping program caused a huge, I mean, you talk about NSA, the president, vice president going apoplectic, that's an understatement. So few people knew about the secret surveillance program that had been launched in the deepest of state secrecy post 9/11 that it wasn't too hard to figure out who might know about the program. And even though I wasn't, as they call, read into it, I had gotten to know about the program quite well. I had blown the whistle on it to Congress and to others. I confronted my own boss originally as to what are we doing violating the Constitution? So I was automatically suspect.
Even though you were not the source for Risen's New York Times article.
Right. I was not. Now, in late February, I did anonymously did make contact with a Baltimore Sun reporter.
And you only, again, totally by the book, it was only unclassified information.
Right. Although technically I was in violation of administrative policy. You were not to have unauthorized contact with a reporter.
But now that's just
policy
at the NSA. That's not a crime, right? Correct?
No.
Okay.
Not a
so
crime.
Everyone's clear. Yeah.
That is correct. But I knew that I risked it being viewed as a crime up to and including what happened to Ellsberg.
Daniel Ellsberg exposed the lies of the Vietnam War when he leaked the war's secret history known as the Pentagon Papers in 1971.
The main ball's Ellsberg. We gotta get this son of a bitch.
For leaking information to the press. Ellsberg became the first whistleblower in history ever indicted under the Espionage Act. Thomas Drake would become the second.
So here you are. I'm ultimately exercising First Amendment, which isn't, remember, the grievance against your own government. People forget about that right in the First Amendment. It didn't matter that I went to them with only unclassified. It was just a matter of when, not if, because what happened after the New York Times article was published, they launched, DOJ, a massive criminal leak investigation. We're talking massive. It ultimately swept up a number of FBI agents, 25 FBI agents full time, including people from their elite mole hunter unit. That's the unit that literally is specially trained to go after real spies. And 5 full-time prosecutors, millions and millions of dollars over multiple years. They were given a directive that came all the way down from Cheney, fine and fry whoever, making it burn them, making an example of them.
So you got the FBI on you, the people that are supposed to be looking out for actual foreign spies. They're on you because you're a concerned citizen about the effective shredding of the Constitution.
Yeah, it became a crime. It became a crime, a state crime, to call out the crimes committed by the state. So I'm part of an active investigation starting in April of 2006. I wasn't indicted for almost 4 years until 4 years later. So it was a living hell for me for 4 years. 2007, I got raided. It's another frozen day. I was getting ready to go down to the National Defense University at Fort McNair, where I actually taught national security policy and leadership ethics. And I'm getting ready, and I look out the window, and guess what I see pulling up from 2 different directions? I live on a dead-end road. FBI agents, about a dozen of them, jumping out of cars and streaming across the front yard. And, you know, my heart's up in my throat. And they read me my Miranda rights, but I chose to continue blowing the whistle and naming names up to and including the president. They didn't want to hear about that. They considered me a direct insider threat, that I was the primary source, and I was such a threat that they had deemed it necessary not just to raid me, but to strip my house of any and all papers and electronics, looking for any evidence at all that they could hang me with. They also raided my office at the National Defense University, and they raided my car.
And they even took a book from your shelf, books as evidence?
They took a number of books.
That is, yeah.
They took Rise and State of War book. I had it. And I asked them why. I says, well, it's been our experience with spies that they'll make notes in the margins and use, invisible ink. I'm not kidding you. I was made into something I actually wasn't. It was a very dark period for me. On a personal level, and extraordinarily, it's probably the low, short of isolation, right? In a tank. I can't even begin. I mean, psychologically, it was an incredibly because you lost all your work, you've lost all of your links, families questioning who you are, relationships are severed. It was a very, very dark period for me in terms of just the isolation, and not knowing what I would do.
This is a result of the raid and the press, negative press that you got at this point.
Oh my God. Well, there was a blip. People were, there was rumors, lots of rumors, but because no one knew, there was an FBI spokesperson at the end of my driveway. They actually had people on camera. It's halfway through the raid. This is bizarre. It's surreal when I think about it. WMAR Channel 2 out of Baltimore, Fox 45 had the big boom antennas sitting out on the Boulevard Road, streaming live from noon on for like the next 5 hours. So it was at the evening news and then the next morning. Okay. That alone caused all kinds of problems with family, my son, school, your father's a traitor. There was all these rumors. In 2008, I'm in New York City trying to clear my head. And I got a call from the liaison FBI agent saying that we need to interview again. And when I got to their field location outside of DC, They said, there's someone here to see you. It was the chief prosecutor on the entire case. And he literally said to me, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Drake, unless you start cooperating with us? I said, there's nothing to cooperate. They wanted me to make a confession. It was Kafkaesque, in a dark room with no windows. I faced 35 years in prison because I dared to call out government wrongdoing and criminality. So you can imagine sitting there, there's a whole lot going through your mind. Because you realize if you do cooperate, you might spend a lot less time in prison, but you're still going to spend time in prison. And he was talking like 20 years. Well, that's better than like 30 or 40. 20? So I broke it off at that point. I literally said this, I will not plea bargain with the truth. I resigned from NSA shortly thereafter, after I got legal counsel. I spent all kinds of money for the next 2 years defending myself because the government tried to get me into a plea agreement in which I would spend a considerable amount of time in prison. But I continued to refuse. So I was at work, and I still work for Apple. I don't advertise it, but I still do. It's where I ended up. That's where I started part-time. I've been there now for 11 years. I was working in one of their greater DC stores, and I was at lunch, and I got this phone call from my criminal defense attorney. He says, where are you? I said, what do you mean? I'm having lunch. He said, he thought I'd been picked up by the FBI and was being booked. He was going to have to come get me. He said, they just handed out an indictment on you. 10 felony count indictment, 5 under the Espionage Act, 4 for making false statements, which themselves were false, and 1 for obstruction of justice. 35 years in prison if I was found guilty on all 10 counts. I didn't know. I mean, this is my criminal defense attorney calling me for the first time to tell me I've been indicted. Turned out it was very public. Both FBI and DOJ spokespersons were actually talking about how bad a person, how much of a traitor I was. That started the active nightmare because I had no money left. I ended up with public defenders. I was declared indigent by the court. I spent the next 14 months knowing that I could still end up in prison. And it didn't matter that none of what they said I had retained for the purpose of disclosure or what I'd actually disclosed, it didn't matter that it was all unclassified. They wanted to frame me. They wanted to make me the example. I'm the only person to date, just like John Kiriakou is the only person to date, who ultimately was indicted, him for the torture program, for revealing it, me for having temerity to actually call out government criminal activity at the highest levels, up to and including the president.
And it's worth noting, this is a time when Obama had just come to office saying he would protect whistleblowers. He was for transparency.
Yes. No one came to my defense. It's important for you to know, and you should find this of interest, no one, even those you would think in Congress, would have shown some sympathy. Neither Patrick Leahy, neither Bernie Sanders, or any number of others came to my defense. My father, he passed away a couple of years ago, World War II veteran. He actually wrote a letter to his local congressperson, Lamar Smith. At the time, you have to remember, this is 2010. He was the presumptive head of the House Judiciary Committee. My father was so concerned by what had happened to me, he wrote a letter. And you know what Lamar Smith's response was? Not in my jurisdiction.
Whoa.
No one wanted to touch it. Did you know not even the ACLU filed a friend of the court brief? There was too much deferring to Obama. I must have been a really, really bad guy. Let him hang. Let him face the music. You did the crime, do the time. I had family members in my saying that. Radio silence. In fact, some congresspersons were looking forward to seeing me in an orange jumpsuit. Now, Obama knew about my case directly. We're talking about Oval Office level meetings, knew about me. they're just making an example of me. It didn't matter.
Just so people know how far they went to framing you, correct me if I'm wrong, but they classified documents that were previously unclassified to make it look like you had leaked classified documents.
Yes. That's the frame job. They literally just took documents that I had been authorized to leave with from NSA, went through the security office clearance, everything. People, this is little known. This wasn't a case like the government argued before the judge. Oh, he started taking out this. We have a whole history of him removing documents in 2002. That's literally false. That was another part of the frame. When I left NSA to go down to the National Defense University, I had to clear my office. There was things that were highly classified that ended up, because of my background in history, that ended up in the history. There's a whole classified history part of NSA. So there was a special office for that. There's other things that went to colleagues in other departments. What was left that I was able to take with me that the security officer officials went through was all unclassified. But it didn't matter. What they did is they took selective documents and retroactively classified them. And in fact, at one point they said, oh, he should have known they were actually classified. And at one point they even argued before the judge they were born classified, which was a whole nother interesting argument that they were attempting to make. And then it got to the point where it didn't matter whether it was classified or not. It deserved, because it came from NSA, he stole it, although I didn't. He stole it, so he purloined it. Because it was NSA material, it deserved the same level of protection as if it were classified. Now, you talk about a pretzel version of classified logic, but see, it's the government's asserting it. In fact, they asserted at one point the judge couldn't say whether he had no bearing on it. You can't, he actually argued that. You cannot say whether it is or isn't.
Jesus.
The problem is that senior officials, my level and even above, including the Haydens of the world, would frequently give public announcements, make pronouncements. They'd be interviewed. They'd be on panels. This all started coming out. I had defense experts as well, started coming out. How can the government argue that this is retroactively classified when General so-and-so or official such and such actually said this in public? So the government's case started to erode. But that took this is 12 months in after I was indicted. And so ultimately what happened, literally the day before we were supposed to go to trial, Ellsberg, who I got to know really, really well, was going to fly in from Kensington, California to actually sit out on the steps of the federal district courthouse in downtown Baltimore, because he was like, wow, this is a critical case. First whistleblower since him, being indicted under the same Title 18 Espionage Act. It's so critical for people, the public, to understand what was going on inside and why was it such a direct threat to the First Amendment and the rule of law. I got to know how corrupted the justice and the prosecutorial system is in terms of what's been happening in the United States from the inside out. And what they do is they just lard up the charges, knowing that if any one of them sticks, it's still several years in prison. So there was a window, and a very small window, in which I ended up, and it was a plea bargain, last second, where they dropped all of the felony counts for a minor misdemeanor. So all the original 10 felony counts in the indictment were dropped. So I ultimately pled out to a minor misdemeanor for doing what? And this is something that people still to this day don't understand or appreciate. For exceeding authorized use of a government computer. Exceeding authorized, not unauthorized, authorized.
That's nuts.
It was a plea agreement. It was the only thing left. No jail time, right? No fine. I did have 1 year probation and 240 hours of community service. So after all those years, after 14 months of facing prison, and that was a distinct possibility, I went free.
Escaping life in prison usually qualifies as a happy ending. But in this case, it wasn't entirely happy. Tom lost his job, lost his money, and his family during his fight to defend himself from prosecution for exposing government crime. And although he escaped prison, the abusive, unconstitutional, and wasteful programs he warned about continued violating America's privacy at a massive scale that remained secret until 2013 revelations from Edward Snowden.
The questions that linger most powerfully for me about the Tom Drake case is that if the institutions that are meant to curtail the unlawful or unconstitutional operations of government instead become complicit in suppressing them, what does that mean for the future? Where do we go?
There's a lot I've seen that's not pretty, and it's that dark side of our own human condition. Sometimes, I wonder why I'm not more cynical. But if I was completely cynical, I wouldn't even be having this interview with you. Look, one of the things that I can share is that if what had happened to me had happened in certain other countries, I would have never had a chance to remain free.
Yeah.
I might have been pushed off of a balcony somewhere. At least I still had rights as an American, but there was no guarantees that when I was in all those interminable court hearings that I would be able to prevail. Was the truth going to matter? Was it going to be what the government could get away with? They threw everything they had. I only touched just on the briefest of the highlights of what they did to me. How far they went to see me in a really, really dark place. Is that what it comes to if you stand up? I mean, Snowden has talked about this himself, and he ends up in Russia, although he never ended up in Russia to end up in Russia.
Mm-hmm. It's another whole smear.
We had a phenomenal conversation. When I was in Moscow in October 2013, with a number of others, we awarded him the Sam Adams. And we had an extraordinary conversation about what all this meant. The trend lines right now in democracies are the evolution of democracy, increasingly autocracy, increasingly strong men, appeal to power, simple solutions. And those who actually have real solutions get dismissed as being, oh, you're part of the intelligentsia, you're too complicated, it can't work. Really? I'll leave your audience and you with what is purportedly a response that Benjamin Franklin gave a woman reporter after the secret Constitutional Convention. And apparently he was asked, basically, what, because all guys, of course, what did you guys do in there? What did you create? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it.